She was tied to a fence like an unwanted animal. Her skin burned, her spirit broken, and no one coming to look for her. He was a Comanche outcast with no words to offer, but in his silence, she found more mercy than she'd ever known. The wind carried dust and silence across the open land. Chayton rode slow, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. He didn't expect to find anyone out here, not this far from the old wagon trails. But then he saw her, just a shadow at first. As he came closer, the shape took form. A girl, tied to a wooden fence post like livestock, arms stretched, wrists torn and bleeding, lips cracked and swollen from the sun. She didn't scream when she saw him, didn't move. Her head stayed low, her hair tangled and falling in front of her face like a curtain. Her dress, once pale blue, was ripped and dusty, sticking to her like old paper. Her shoes were gone. One foot was cut open. He saw dried blood caked to her heel. Chayton stopped his horse and dismounted without a word. His boots sank softly into the dirt. The only sound was the wind brushing through the brittle grass. He stepped close. The girl didn't flinch, but her eyes followed him, blue, wide, and terrified. He didn't ask her name. He didn't need to know what had happened, not yet. What he knew was enough. She had been left to die. Carefully, he pulled a small knife from his belt. He didn't touch her skin, only the ropes. They came apart slow, like they were part of her now. When the last strand broke, she fell. Not hard, just dropped, like a sack of bones. He caught her before she hit the ground. She was so light, too light. Her body didn't fight or cling, just sagged in his arms like someone already halfway gone. He knelt in the dirt, cradling her gently. "You're safe now," he said quietly, even though he knew she didn't believe it. Maybe she didn't even understand him. He didn't ask who did this. He didn't ask where she came from. He just pulled a blanket from his saddle and wrapped it around her. Then he lifted her onto his horse, swung himself up behind her, and turned toward the hills. She didn't speak once, not even a whisper. But he could feel the heat from her skin, the way her fingers curled faintly into the blanket, as if trying to hold on to something. Anything. By the time the sun dipped low behind the hills, he had found a clearing with enough shelter for the night. He made a fire, set her down with care, gave her water in a tin cup and watched her drink slow, like her throat forgot how to swallow. She didn't cry. He didn't ask her to. That night, under the stars, she slept beside the fire, still wrapped in his blanket, and Chayton sat nearby, silent and watchful, wondering what kind of world could throw away a girl like that. But more than that, he wondered what it would take to bring her back. She woke just before dawn. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers, and the man who had saved her was sitting cross-legged nearby, sharpening a blade with calm, steady strokes. Her first instinct was to shrink back, but the blanket around her shoulders was warm and smelled faintly of cedar. It was the first warmth she'd felt in days. He looked up and met her gaze, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then, softly, he said something in a language she didn't know. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat still ached, and the words were gone, buried beneath too much pain. He tried English next. Just one word. "Name?" She hesitated, then dropped her gaze to the dirt. She wouldn't say it. That name belonged to the girl they'd left tied to that fence. She didn't want it anymore. He watched her for a long time, then nodded. "Wayan," he said gently, tapping his chest. "Means woman." She didn't react, but the word stayed in her head like a thread of smoke. The next few hours passed in silence. He gave her more water, a strip of dried meat, and helped her onto the horse again. She still didn't speak. Her body ached too much, her heart even more. But she watched him, watched how he moved, how his eyes stayed always on the horizon, always searching, always protecting. By the time they stopped again that evening, she felt less afraid. He hadn't tried to touch her, hadn't asked questions, hadn't looked at her like the others did. Instead, he gave her space. And a name. A strange one. But it was better than the last one she heard someone call her. That night, she lay beneath the stars again, wrapped in the same blanket, listening to the quiet sounds of the land and the occasional murmur of the Comanche's voice as he spoke to the fire. She didn't know the words, but his tone was soft, like he was speaking to the sky, or maybe to someone who wasn't there anymore. She thought of running. She even sat up once, testing her strength. But her legs trembled, and the thought of going back into the world that tied her to that fence was worse than staying. She lay back down and closed her eyes, and somewhere, between sleep and memory, the name whispered again in her mind. Weon. Not her name. But not a bad name either. The third day brought wind and clouds. They moved through dry hills, avoiding trails and roads. The land stretched out like a great sleeping animal, bare, wild, and full of secrets. Trees clung low to the soil, bent by storms, and the grass whispered under the breath of the wind. She rode in front of him now, steadier in the saddle, though she still gripped the horn tightly with both hands. Her body ached, her back sore from the miles, but she didn't complain. She didn't know if she had the right. The man behind her hadn't said more than a few words since yesterday, and that quiet had become its own strange comfort. He never rushed her, never told her to move faster. He simply let the land carry them at its own pace. When she faltered, he slowed. When she grew tired, he stopped. Once, when she slipped while climbing a slope, he caught her elbow, not with force, just a firm touch to keep her steady. She looked at him then, and for the first time she didn't see danger in his face, just presence. Calm, control, the kind that didn't need noise to be felt. They came to a narrow ravine before dusk and set up camp near a bend in the rocks. The sound of a hidden creek flowed faintly in the distance. Birds called from somewhere high above. She watched him unpack his saddlebags with care, placing each item in a spot that made sense to him. She didn't ask questions. She just sat nearby, hands folded in her lap, her fingers running over the frayed edge of the blanket he'd given her. He motioned to a patch of dry brush. "Wood," he said, then pointed at her, then back at the fire pit. She understood. She rose slowly, legs stiff, and began gathering twigs and branches. It wasn't much, but when she returned, he gave a small nod. That nod made something small inside her flicker, like she'd done something right. He cooked over the fire, corn roasted in coals. Strips of meat sizzled on flat stones. She watched, hungry but wary. The smell made her stomach twist in ways it hadn't in days. When he handed her a tin plate, she hesitated for a moment, then nodded and began to eat. Slowly. Carefully. Her hands still trembled. Afterward, he opened a worn pouch from his pack. Inside were herbs, dried leaves and thin roots. He crushed some into a pot of boiling water. The scent filled the air, sharp, earthy, calming. It reminded her of something long ago, a woman's hands, a soft hum, her mother maybe, before everything turned hard. He poured the water into a tin cup and held it out. "Drink," he said. "Sleep better." She took it. The cup was warm in her palms. She sniffed it, then took a small sip. The taste was bitter, but not unpleasant. It settled in her stomach like a stone, but one that carried heat, not pain. She glanced up at him. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. The fire popped and cracked as night fell. Shadows stretched long and the stars blinked one by one into the sky. She lay beneath the blanket again, this time not curled up so tightly. Her body still remembered the fear. But her heart was listening to something else now. She watched him from the corner of her eye as he sat cross-legged, murmuring softly in his language. His voice rose and fell with the wind, low and steady. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to the dark, to the stars, maybe to ghosts. And then, just as her eyes began to drift closed, he looked over. "You strong," he said. Not a question, not a compliment, just truth. She blinked, unsure how to answer. No one had ever told her that before. Not her father, not her mother, not the teachers who gave up on her when she stopped speaking in school. Not even the boy who had told her she was pretty once, before he turned his back and let her hang like a shameful secret. But now, here in the quiet night, this stranger, this Comanche, had said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. She turned away, cheeks burning in the firelight, and bit down the tears that wanted to rise. She didn't want to cry in front of him. Not yet. Sleep came slow. Her body fought it, muscles tight with old memory, but the tea helped. So did the fire, and maybe, just maybe, so did his presence. And just before her mind sank into dreams, she whispered something she hadn't said in years. "Good night." She didn't know if he heard, but she swore she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, just a little, like maybe, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't so alone either. The third day brought wind and clouds. They moved through dry hills, avoiding trails and roads. She rode in front of him now, steadier in the saddle, though she still gripped the horn tightly with both hands. He never rushed her, never told her to move faster. He simply let the land carry them at its own pace. When they stopped for the night, he showed her how to gather firewood. She didn't speak, but she followed his lead. Her hands were still tender, wrists bruised and raw, but the pain was dull now, like an echo. He cooked over the fire. Corn roasted in coals. Strips of meat sizzled on flat stones. She watched, hungry but wary. When he handed her a tin plate, she nodded once and began to eat, slowly, carefully. Afterward, he took a pouch from his saddlebag, opened it, and sprinkled herbs into a pot of boiling water. The scent was sharp and strange, earthy, bitter, calming. He poured some into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Sleep," he said. She took it, drank. The warmth filled her stomach and worked its way up into her chest. It didn't erase the fear, but it softened it. Later, when the stars came out, she lay curled beneath the blanket, listening to the creek nearby. She didn't know this man's story, didn't know why he had helped her, or what he wanted in return. But there was something in the way he moved, in the quiet of his presence, that made her believe, for the first time in a long time, that not everyone wanted to hurt her. Before sleep took her, she whispered one word. "Thank you." He didn't reply, but when she looked at him, he was already watching her. And this time, she didn't look away. The sun hung low when they came upon the Comanche camp, nestled between two ridges where the river bent like a sleeping snake. Smoke curled into the sky from small fires, and the air was filled with the smell of roasting meat and horses. Children stopped playing to stare. Women paused in their work, heads tilting toward the strangers approaching. Chayton didn't slow. He guided the horse into the heart of the camp, where the older men sat near a central fire, their eyes sharp and unreadable. Elsie felt their stares settle on her like stones. Her hands gripped the saddle tighter. She knew what she looked like, pale, bruised, still wearing the torn dress that had clung to her since the day she was tied to the fence. Her hair was cleaner now thanks to the river and Chayton's comb, but it still hung in wild curls around her shoulders. He dismounted and reached up to help her down. She hesitated but took his hand. The moment her boots hit the earth, a hush fell over the fire circle. One of the older warriors stood. His face was carved with age, eyes dark and hard like river rock. He pointed at her, then spoke in a rush of words she couldn't understand. Chayton listened, arms crossed over his chest, his face still. The man kept talking, voice rising, spit flying from his mouth. Then he turned and spat at the ground near her feet. Elsie flinched. Every nerve screamed to shrink, to disappear, to find the shadows and stay there. But she stayed still, because Chayton hadn't moved, because she didn't want to run again. Another elder stood and spoke now, not shouting, but firm. He gestured between Chayton and Elsie. His face wasn't cruel, but doubtful, confused, as if trying to understand something that didn't make sense. She could feel it, the tension, the disbelief. Why would one of their own bring her here? She was the outsider, the burden. And maybe Chayton would agree. Maybe now that he had brought her this far, he'd hand her over to someone else, walk away, let them decide what to do with her. She braced herself, ready for that moment. But Chayton stepped forward, slowly, calmly. His voice when he spoke was low and steady, not loud, not angry, but it cut through the air like a blade through water. He spoke in Comanche, not to defend her, not to explain, but to declare. Whatever he said, it made the old man sit back down without another word. No one interrupted. No one dared. Elsie couldn't breathe. The camp fell quiet. Only the fire cracked, sending sparks into the darkening sky. He turned then, met her eyes. He had chosen. Not just to save her once, but again. here, in front of his people. And in that moment, she wasn't a burden. She wasn't a mistake. She was his decision. And that changed everything. The hills turned green as they traveled farther east. Spring had come softly, bringing color back to the land. Small flowers bloomed between rocks. The streams ran clearer, and Elsie felt something inside her begin to open, like the tight bud of a wild rose. Chayton had started to show her things, not with long lessons or big words, just small signs, a glance at the ground, a motion with his hand. He pointed out the faint lines in the dirt where a rabbit had passed, the broken twigs left by a deer, the way bird songs changed when a stranger was near. She listened, watched, learned. He showed her how to press her lips together and make the soft call of a mourning dove, 3 notes, rising and falling. It was a warning signal, he said, in case they ever got separated. She practiced until she got it right, and he nodded with quiet approval. Sometimes he picked plants and handed them to her. No good, he'd say, tossing one aside. This one, good for stomach. Another. Fire plant, helps with pain. She kept the names in her head, even if she didn't always understand the words. There was a rhythm to the way he spoke, slow and sure, like each word had weight. He didn't speak unless it mattered. One afternoon they stopped to rest near a stream. Chayton went ahead to check the path, and Elsie stayed behind to refill their water skins. She knelt beside the water, humming softly, the pouch of herbs he'd given her tied at her waist like a badge of trust. Then she heard it. A sharp shout. She jumped to her feet, dropping the skins. Chayton was down, farther up the slope, clutching his leg. When she reached him, she saw the mark just above his ankle, a pair of puncture wounds swelling fast. The rattlesnake was gone, but its damage remained. His face was tight, not from panic, but pain. "Bag," he said through gritted teeth, pointing to her side. "Green leaves. Mash. Fast." Her hands shook, but she did as he said. She found the right herb, crushed it between 2 stones, and pressed the poultice onto the bite. The mixture oozed warm and wet against his skin. He lay back, breathing hard, but his eyes stayed on her. "You remember," he said, voice rough. She nodded. "Brave," he added. Just that one word, and it broke something in her. Not like glass, like a shell. Her lips trembled, and then she smiled. Not wide, not perfect, but real. The first in months. He saw it. And though his face didn't change much, something passed between them, quiet, deep, unspoken. Later, as the fire crackled and he rested, she sat close, her fingers gently tracing the lines of a plant he'd drawn in the dirt. She didn't feel like someone lost anymore. She felt useful. She felt seen. And for the first time, the name Elsie didn't sound like a burden. It sounded like someone who could belong. The sky was pale when they reached the edge of a wide field, dotted with cottonwood trees and the smell of ash on the wind. In the distance, smoke rose from a small camp. Wagons, horses, voices. Chayton slowed his horse, eyes narrowing. Elsie followed his gaze, her heart tightening without knowing why. They moved forward carefully. Chayton stayed quiet, but his body was tense. Elsie felt it too, something pressing in her chest, like a warning she couldn't name. As they approached the clearing, a man in a long black coat stepped from one of the wagons. A priest. His hair was gray at the temples, and his face looked tired, but his eyes widened when he saw her. "Elsie?" he said. She froze. Her hands gripped the saddle tighter. Another voice came from behind. "That's her. That's John Lee's girl." A second man stepped forward, taller, broader, with a rough beard and red skin from too many years under the sun. She knew that face. Her uncle, Levi. "Uncle Levi," she said, almost without meaning to. Her voice sounded small. He marched toward her, eyes full of anger and disbelief. "What in God's name are you doing with him?" He pointed at Chayton like he was pointing at a disease. "Get off that horse, now. You're coming back with us." She didn't move. "She's been taken," he said to the priest. "Look at her. She's confused. Doesn't even know who she is anymore." "I know exactly who I am," Elsie said, but the words came out like a whisper. Levi's eyes narrowed. "You've been corrupted. You don't know what's good for you anymore. You need help. You need to come home." Home. That word hit her like a stone in the stomach. Home had been a place of silence, of doors slammed, of being stared at like a mistake. And then, of ropes and fences and sunburned skin. Chayton said nothing. He didn't step forward. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he looked at her, steady as the mountains, and said, "Your choice." The words stopped everything. The wind, the shouting, the pounding in her chest. Levi reached out, but she pulled back. Not fast, just enough. "You don't get to choose for me anymore," she said, louder this time. Her voice shook, but it held. That night, they camped far from the wagons, deep in a grove of trees where the wind whispered through the leaves. Chayton lit the fire while Elsie sat across from him, staring into the flames. "You knew I might go with them," she said. "Yes," he replied, "but you didn't try to stop me. I would not keep what wants to leave." She looked at him then, and for the first time she understood what freedom really was. Not just running, not just surviving, but choosing. And tonight, she had chosen him. Not because he saved her, but because when the past came to take her back, he had been the only one who let her stand on her own. The days passed slower after the meeting with the settlers. The land grew warmer, the grasses taller, and birds sang louder in the mornings, but something quiet had settled between them. Not cold, not angry, just something heavy and hard to name. Chayton said even less now. His silences stretched longer than before. He still helped her, still watched over her with the same steady eyes, but the warmth he had begun to show felt tucked away, like it had been folded back into his chest. Elsie noticed. She felt it in the way he stood farther from the fire at night, in how his eyes didn't linger on her face the way they had. She told herself not to be hurt. He had given her a choice and respected it. That meant something, but still, she missed the feeling of being seen. She wanted to understand him, truly understand him. She had given him pieces of her past, enough to hurt, enough to trust. But when she asked him about his family, his people, his eyes went far away, and his mouth stayed shut. One afternoon, while collecting water, she tried again. "Did you ever have a sister?" she asked gently. He was quiet for so long she thought he hadn't heard. "Yes," he finally said. That was all. "What happened to her?" He looked up at the sky like the answer was hidden in the clouds. Then he turned away and said, "No more questions." She didn't ask again. That evening, he left camp just after sunset. He didn't say where he was going. Elsie watched him disappear between the trees, the firelight catching the edge of his shoulder for a moment before he was gone. She waited, heart tight. Then, after some time, she followed. She moved carefully, not wanting to disturb him. The trees thinned as they neared the river, and the moon lit the water in silver waves. She found him sitting on a rock by the edge, back straight, face turned toward the stars. His voice floated softly across the water, a song, low and slow, full of sorrow. The language wasn't English, but she didn't need a translation. The meaning was in the sound, in the pain, in the memory he kept locked behind his stillness. She didn't speak, didn't move closer right away. She just listened. After a while, she stepped softly onto the rocks beside him and sat down. He glanced at her but didn't speak. She didn't expect him to. The song faded into silence. They sat like that for a long time, side by side, feet nearly touching the water. No words passed between them, but something else did. Something stronger than speech. It was a quiet promise. That she wouldn't ask again. That he didn't have to carry it alone. That he didn't have to explain the broken parts of himself for her to stay. In that silence, Elsie didn't feel far from him anymore. She felt closer than she ever had. The days rolled on like the river beside them, quiet, steady, and full of small changes. Summer warmed the land, and the hard edge of survival gave way to rhythm. Mornings were filled with the sound of birds and the smell of fire-roasted beans. Afternoons passed with fishing lines dipped in cool water, or walking between the wildflowers that grew taller each week. Nights brought stars and stories told in half smiles and soft glances. They had made a home, though no one would call it that by usual standards. A tent made from stretched hides, a simple fire pit ringed with smooth stones, and a place to hang their drying herbs. But to Elsie, it was more than any house had ever been, because no one looked through her here. No one called her a mistake. No one left her behind. She had learned to move through the land the way Chayton did, quiet-footed, alert, thankful. She could tell the age of a track, catch rabbits in a snare, even skin a deer without flinching. She wore soft leather shoes now, stitched by her own hands, and her hair was longer, stronger, braided down her back like the Comanche women she had once watched from afar. Chayton had changed too. Not in big ways. He still spoke little, still watched more than he said, but his silences were softer now, not hiding, just resting. He smiled more. Let her touch linger when she reached for his arm, and sometimes when the fire burned low, he would sing. Not loud, not for her, but she listened anyway. One afternoon, as the shadows stretched long and golden over the camp, Elsie sat by the fire with a small piece of wood in her lap. She had found it days ago, smooth, warm-colored, shaped like a teardrop. She carved it slowly with the same knife he'd given her weeks back, cutting away the rough edges, sanding it with stone, threading it with a strip of leather she had softened in the river. When she was done, she waited for him to return from checking the traps. When he walked into camp, quiet as ever, she stood and held it out to him. "It's not from my people," she said, "but it's from me." Chayton looked at the small pendant in her hands, then at her. He took it gently, like it was something sacred. For a moment, he just held it, thumb brushing the curve she had carved. Then, without a word, he slipped it over his head, letting it rest against his chest. He stepped closer, so close she could hear the breath in his throat. "Your name," he said, voice low, deep, steady, "is not Wyan." She looked up at him, her heart beating loud in her ears. "It's Elsie," he said. "And here, you're not forgotten." The wind moved through the trees like a sigh. She didn't cry, but she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held. That night, they sat by the fire, side by side, not needing words. Two souls, once broken and cast aside, now stitched together by silence, kindness, and time. They had no town, no church, no witnesses. But they had this. And for the first time in her life, Elsie knew this was home. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more heartfelt tales from the Old West. Thanks for riding along with us.